Dozens arrested in Hong Kong for the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary. Cuba hosts a secret Chinese spy base, and a Chinese warship almost crashes into a U.S. warship. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Incogni. You probably know the companies are collecting your personal data, but you may not realize just how many. Dozens, maybe hundreds, most of which you've never heard of. You have no idea what they're doing with it. Incogni helps stop them. I'll explain more at the end. Well, it happened again. Less than a week after a Chinese pilot got dangerously close to a U.S. Air Force plane over the South China Sea, this week, a Chinese warship almost collided with a U.S. one. On Monday, a U.S. destroyer and a Canadian frigate were traveling through the Taiwan Strait on a freedom of navigation patrol in international waters. This global news footage shows how a Chinese warship cut right in front of the U.S. ship, getting dangerously close. The U.S. Navy said the Chinese ship got within 150 yards of its ship and that it had to slow down to avoid hitting it. The commander of the Canadian frigate saw it happen and said it wasn't an accident on China's part.
The fact that this was announced over the radio prior to doing it clearly indicated that it was intentional.
Very smooth, China, very smooth. Now, all this took place as U.S. and China defense chiefs were attending a security conference in Singapore this week. Man, talk about awkward timing. If I were China, I would at least wait until I didn't have to look the U.S. in the eye when the report came in. But when China's defense minister was asked about it, he said that the passage of the Allied Western vessels on freedom of navigation patrols was a provocation to China. So basically, the same reason China gave for its dangerous pilot stunt, that it was the United States' fault for being in China's backyard. Never mind that the U.S. was in international airspace and international waters. Now, when I said this was awkward timing, I should have said it would have been awkward timing if the defense chiefs were actually talking, which they are not. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin tried to call China back when a Chinese spy balloon flew over the U.S. early this year and only got the answering machine. A White House spokesman said communication has been curtailed between the Pentagon and China ever since former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last August. The silent treatment. It's the worst. Of course, Austin was still hoping to meet with his counterpart, Li Shangfu, on the sidelines of the conference this week. But China is still unhappy that the U.S. sanctioned Li in 2018 for importing Russian weapons and said no thanks. Now, it's not like China is saying it wants war. Li did give lip service to improving the relationship when he said war with the U.S. would be an unbearable disaster. But kind of like plowing in front of someone's warship, what he didn't make it better either. And after the break, some U.S. officials did get meetings with their Chinese counterparts, but was that a good idea? Welcome back. This week marks the 34th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The massacre was the end of a weeks-long student-led protest movement all over China, calling for better human rights and democratic reforms. The biggest protest was in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, the nerve center of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese leaders declared martial law to clear the streets and, as they say, the rest was history. We don't know exactly how many were killed, but a declassified British cable puts the number at over 10,000. For years, the June 4th massacre has been commemorated in Hong Kong. It was the only place technically in China where that could happen. But since 2020, those commemorations have been banned. Not because the Communist Party is squeezing the life out of Hong Kong now, no. It was because of COVID. So why remove the statues? But COVID can't be used as an excuse this year, so what happened? Well, Hong Kong police detained dozens of people who they suspected might try to commemorate the day. 8 people, including activists and artists, were detained on the eve of the anniversary, and on June 4th, police took 23 others away on suspicion of breaching public peace. However, pro-China groups were able to hold a memorial on the same day, for the British handover of Hong Kong 26 years ago, which actually happened in July. But hey, when you got a protest to paper over, why wait? Despite the Communist Party still trying to sweep that bit of ugly history under the rug, the U.S. sent diplomats to Beijing for meetings this week. These are lower-level diplomats, since high-level talks are still basically frozen. But the White House denied its timing was maybe just a little bit tone-deaf.
Was that decision a messaging misstep?
We would not call it a misstep. I mean, this was a long-planned trip, and this is the way the schedules worked out. But I think, honestly, people will be criticizing the timing of Tiananmen Square, just making a whole heck of a lot out of nothing.
And guess who also got a meeting in Beijing? CIA Director Bill Burns. He secretly traveled to China in May to try to thaw relations, which I would say went about as well as thawing an ice cube with an air conditioner in the North Pole. Secretary of State Antony Blinken keeps saying he's going to get his China meeting back one of these days, but like that friend who always has a get-rich-quick plan, it just never seems to quite pan out, or at least it hasn't yet. Blinken called off his trip to Beijing at the 11th hour in February after a Chinese spy balloon flew across the entire United States. For more on that scandal, check out the episode we did on that recently. It's quite a wild ride. Another possible reason Blinken hasn't gone yet, he's taking the advice of his own department. The State Department has China on its reconsider travel list, citing the risk of detention or arbitrary enforcement of local laws. Yeah, we wouldn't want the United States' top diplomat to go missing in China. He might just get put on a spy balloon to nowhere. And speaking of spying, is China building a spy base in Cuba? The Wall Street Journal cited U.S. officials familiar with highly classified intelligence as saying there's an agreement for Cuba to host a Chinese spy base focusing on the U.S. It said an eavesdropping facility in Cuba, roughly 100 miles from Florida, would allow Chinese intelligence services to scoop up electronic communications throughout the southeastern U.S., where many military bases are located, and monitor U.S. ship traffic. China reportedly offered to pay Cuba $7 billion for it, although it's not clear where that agreement is at. The Journal says they had reached an agreement in principle, but sources wouldn't say if its construction has begun or not. And after the break, the UK gets tough on China. Welcome back. The UK is finally getting tough on China. Or, well, maybe. Sort of. It told China to shut its illegal UK-based police stations this week. These underground police stations were first publicized by the human rights group Safeguard Defenders last September. Now, the UK has told the Chinese embassy to shut them down. However, the UK Security Minister told Parliament they so far haven't found evidence of illegal activity at the addresses associated with the alleged Chinese police outposts. The UK government is also putting a timeline on getting rid of Chinese-made security cameras, which, as you can imagine, aren't very secure. British lawmakers have previously called for a ban on the sale and use of security cameras made by Hikvision and Dahua, two partly state-owned Chinese firms, over privacy fears and concerns of the company's products being linked to human rights abuses in China. According to the Daily Mail, Chinese cameras were being used at UK military bases despite lawmakers banning them on government buildings. It's not just a military problem, though. A report by civil liberties watchdog Big Brother Watch found over 60% of public bodies in the UK currently operate Chinese state-owned surveillance cameras. Yes, UK surveillance cameras. Cameras for the Chinese government to surveil the UK. There is some good China news this week, though. In a rare victory for the media, a Hong Kong court has overturned the conviction of a Hong Kong journalist. The court ruled that substantial and grave injustice was done to Choi Yuk-ling, an investigative journalist who also goes by the name Bao Choi. Bao was convicted in 2021 of improperly accessing car records for a documentary she did about a mob attack on Hong Kong protesters. To find out who was transporting the attackers, she looked up license plate records from a public database. She had to select a reason for her search from a drop-down menu that didn't have an option for media work, so she chose other traffic and transport-related issues. The court found that she didn't knowingly make a false statement in order to get the car records and granted her appeal. And this episode is sponsored by Incogni. Whenever you do anything online or use apps on your phone, there are a huge number of companies that collect your personal data. When I signed up for Incogni a year ago, I discovered there were dozens of data brokers that potentially had my private information without my permission. Some types of data theft you can easily stop, like by not using Temu to shop or using TikTok to whatever. But other types of data theft are harder. A lot of private companies are accessing your data because you accidentally gave permission through a third-party site. But there's a way to stop them. That's what Incogni does for you. It writes to these companies using specific legal language, forcing them to delete your personal information. Incogni has already gotten my details removed from 102 of these sketchy data brokers, and a lot more are in progress. And I didn't have to do anything after signing up. Incogni just handles it. So I recommend you get Incogni for yourself. Click the link below or go to incogni.com/uncensored. For a limited time, the first 100 people to use the code uncensored will get 60% off. Get your personal data off the market with Incogni. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.